Welcome, everybody. Good morning. Welcome to the session Measurement Matters, the role of measurement in the open science reform. This session is part of the Research Transparency campaign, whose goal is to increase awareness of pre-registration and other open research practices that are necessary to ensure transparency in the research workflow. This campaign is organized by the Erasmus Research Institute of Management by Elisette Guzman Ramirez, the Erasmus University Library with Muteleni Nadimi, and Erasmus Research Services with myself. My name is Antonio Schettino, and I'm Coordinator Open Science at Erasmus Research Services. Among the things that I do, I develop educational and training materials on open science for students, researchers, and support staff. I also directly support researchers in implementing open science in their workflow. So if you want to open up your projects, just send me an email and I'll do my best to help. Also, please consider joining the Open Science Community Rotterdam, where researchers and support staff help each other in learning, discussing, and adopting open science practices. For more information, you will see a link in the chat. In today's session, we'll talk about the important but often underappreciated role of unreliable measurement in the replication crisis or credibility crisis that are affecting several disciplines. Our invited speaker is Eiko, Associate Professor at the Clinical Psychology Unit at Leiden University. His interests include psychopathology, in particular depressive disorders, statistics, for example, network analysis, reliable measurements, and theory building and testing. He was recently awarded the prestigious ERC starting grant for a project called WARNED, whose goal is to develop a personalized early warning system that can reliably forecast depression in university students before it occurs. He also explained the main goals of the WARNED project with Lego, and we'll put the link in the chat because it's, I found it cool. Before giving the floor to our speaker, a few reminders. Please keep your microphone muted during the session. Video is optional. You know that this is being recorded. If you don't mind, we encourage you to turn the video on so that the speaker sees a bunch of friendly faces. And if you have questions, there are two ways to ask them. You can click on the raise hand button after the talk. We will give you the floor so that you can ask the question yourself. Or you can write down your question in the chat, and after the presentation, I will read it on your behalf. That's it for me. Eiko, thanks for joining us, and the floor is yours.
All right. I'll share again. I hope you can see this.
Yes.
Shout out from the Open Science Community Leiden, of course. So we're doing similar things here. And thanks for having me in the symposium. Super, super excited to talk about measurement as always. The talk today is inspired by a talk I gave half a year ago. I changed the slides completely, but it was a talk on open science horrors organized by a few folks across the Netherlands. And so I thought I would give a talk on measurement horrors and what lack of transparency can do. We'll check the time, 5 past. Okay, so I'll try to finish in 20 minutes. So this is the one of the Mars orbiters. Many of you will know the story. After over 290 days of flying all by itself, this cute little robot satellite, all by itself through the dark, empty space in the cold, without a blanket, this pure little robot guy, he made it all the way to Mars and then crashed into Mars, remnants or vestiges of an atmosphere. And this happened because, as many of you will know, Europeans and Americans worked on the project, but they both worked in different units of measurement. Imperial versus metric units. And of course, with a bit of more transparency regarding measurement, this would not have happened, but both parties assumed the other party would use their system of measurement. This is another horror story, and these are real. We're not talking psychology, right? These are real life things that have impact on the lives of many people. This is physics. You would think measurement is easy, or engineering, right? This is even the mesoscale. We're not talking macro scale or micro scale. These are like meters or feet. This is easy stuff for humans to understand. And these are not nanometers or something. So this is a bridge Germans and the Swiss built across the Rhine. And when you do that across countries, what you do is you build the bridge from both sides simultaneously and you connect at the middle. And once they were like 30 meters apart, the engineers on both sides were like, something doesn't seem right. We don't think the bridge will be level. And so what happened is that they were 28 centimeters different from each other. And the reason is simply because there are two metrics that measure height above sea level. One is measured in Amsterdam and the other is, I believe, in Geneva. And yeah, they're different levels. They're 28 centimeters difference. So again, measurement transparency helps here. I have much more on this in psychology, but I cut it to be able to make sure I get to the main points today. And the main points are measurement is difficult, even in mesoscopic meter feet scales, right? Not even talking about things like trying to measure people's internal states and subjective feelings and so forth, which is much harder, which I believe makes psychology a very hard science, by the way, not a soft science, but it's a different topic. And the second point is measurement is not only difficult, but getting it right is very important. Measurement matters. And shout out to my colleague Jessica Flake, who I will talk about today quite a bit. I've been working with her a lot on these topics of measurement. And we wrote this brief, one-page thingy called Measurement Matters that has some of the core arguments I'm going to make today. All right, so when it comes to the open science or open scholarship, which I think is a better term, but also a little longer, so I'm going to stick to open science today, and in written communication, try to sneak in the word open scholarship more and more, because it's also about teaching and equality. But when it comes to our reform, transparency is a cornerstone, but we really don't talk about measurement very much, transparency of measurement. And I'm going to try to remedy that today. So why does this matter? This is a paper, and I honestly don't know anything about this measure, and I don't know if that's p-hacked or not. I really couldn't tell you. It's just an example, right? So what the authors did here is they take a scale, such as the SSPS scale, doesn't even matter what that measures, like let's say 20 items, and they didn't find a significant effect for the whole scale, and so they made subscales, a positive and a negative subscale. Let's say each of them has 10 items. I don't know if that's true, but something like that happened here. And you all know the Garden of Forking Paths, of course, by Gelman and Loken. So what could have happened here, and I don't know the ground truth, but this happens often in psychology, that they used the full scale, didn't find a significant result. They removed a couple of items, and you have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of ways to remove 1 or 2 or 3 items from a 20-item scale. You have nearly infinite degrees of freedom, right? And then you can justify it post hoc, being like, yeah, this item showed like a low, correlation, or there was something weird with the residuals, or we didn't like it, or it had a floor effect or a seeding effect, or the variance wasn't great, or there's so much you can come up with. You can use a sum score, you can use a principal components analysis, you can use a factor analysis, you can combine subscales, or as in this case, you can break subscales apart, right? So I think of this as measure hacking. And I know that many of you will think of this as p-hacking because, of course, it's about analysis, analytic choices. But I think the underlying issue here is actually the measurement, right? And I think transparent measurement practices will reduce possibilities for p-hacking in these cases. If we declare our measures and how we will use our measures transparently, things will be a little easier. And that's the general theme. This is actually a slide by Jessica Flake from a workshop we gave a couple of years ago. I think it's still very, very important, up to date. Today, the focus of our reforms has been on p-hacking, pre-registration, and power, all super important things. But this has happened at the level of statistics, and my work in the last few years has focused on the level below that, measurement and theory. Interestingly, when you talk to measurement people, they always think theory is part of measurement, so they have a very big view of what measurement entails. For me, these are two different things, but Jessica and I came up with the idea of these questionable measurement practices that underlie and allow some of the p-hacking we see in psychology to continue, and possibly other social sciences as well, and many areas beyond that, but I'm not an expert on this, so I don't feel like I'm comfortable speaking about that. And even if you have fully pre-registered your analytic pipeline, even if you share your R code with me, you can still switch out measures. They're not hard-coded in the R code, it's just, it says column 4 to 7. But if you remove items or not, you can still do that, and so on. No.
Dobra, bo no, na razie, pa. No to nic na razie, no, na razie, później, pa.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Okay, I unmuted myself. I don't think I was muted on purpose, so I'll just continue here. So another form of measure hacking is outcome switching. I don't know if many of you know this because it's more common in clinical sciences. When you run a clinical trial in psychology, psychiatry, or medicine generally, You have often one primary outcome you need to declare in advance, and that is where you calculate your main statistic of interest. And authors in 2018 looked at 89,000 registered clinical trials, registered on a government website in the US, and they found that roughly a third of them had their primary outcome changed, and not surprisingly, the outcome changes were associated with industry funding, right? Because the industry has more interest than academics to find significant outcomes for drug trials and things like this. This is a huge, I mean, this paper has 100 citations, and I don't know why it doesn't have tens of thousands of citations. This really matters, this stuff. It raises questions about the entire FDA approval process, because these are based on primary outcomes, and if they're changed after study completion date, well, then the studies are p-hacked, right? This highlights the value of pre-registration over just registration, which is a big difference, of course, in medical trials, where both are possible. And it highlights the value of pre-registering your measures, not just your analysis. And in my own field, clinical psychology, there was a systematic review of 163 clinical trials about psychotherapies, for example, and only 1% of those had all their measures pre-registered in advance, which makes the vast majority of these studies questionable, to my opinion. And Jessica and I understand the word questionable not as bad, but as questionable. We have questions. We are not sure. We lack transparency to evaluate the validity of your claims. We have questions. And if you do research, you don't want us to have questions anymore, basically, about your study, right? I think I'll skip this part here. It's on the OSF. Linus Neumann, one of my students, wrote a thesis on the Hamilton rating scale for depression, which has about 30,000 citations. The scale exists in dozens of different versions, like 6 items, all the way to 36 items, and has been translated, each of these versions, into dozens of languages. And Linus basically looked at 100 randomly drawn papers using the Hamilton scale in clinical trials from high impact journals, and found that 40% of these studies do not reference what version of the Hamilton scale they use. And that's a huge problem, because the short Russian version, if you find significant effects, it might not replicate in the long Indonesian version or something like this. But the authors don't give us a chance for reproducibility or replicability, because we don't even know what measure they used. And that's just, one example. And that's, I think it's a problem. Okay, and now I want to spend a couple of minutes on something that I have encountered quite recently: proprietary scales. So in the introduction, my warranty project was mentioned, and for this we put together a 90-minute baseline battery. These are online questionnaires, right? Like, how sad are you right now? Did you have any traumatic experience in the last year? Psychology, stuff like that. In our field, it is quite common that folks take grant money for a project such as mine, for example. They develop a scale. I could make a scale on treatment adherence. I want to know if my people in the study take their medication. And so I come up with questions like, do you take your medication regularly? Did you today take your medication? Stuff like this, right? Then people slap copyright on their scales, which is fine under US copyright law. You can do that. It's common to do that, actually. And they make private money now because they charge for scale use, although this is funded by taxpayer money. And the authors then prohibit publication of the content of the scale. And I'm going to give you some examples for this and the consequences of this. And this stuff really happens all the time. So I'm going to use 2 examples today. I really can't speak to the authors. I don't know these people. Maybe they're brilliant authors or terrible researchers. Maybe they're angels and maybe they're devils. I have no possibility to speak to this, but I can speak to the practices. And I condemn these practices. I think that's really problematic. These practices are legally protected, but I think they're ethically really problematic. Right? So that's the setup. So there's a piece I recommend everybody to read in Science 2017 about the MMAS-8. This is a treatment adherence scale. So my example from before was not totally randomly chosen. And it has what I call rocket science items, such as, do you sometimes forget to take your medications? I'm not allowed to reprint this item, actually, I believe, on my slides. So we'll see what happens. Since 2006, the author team of the MMAS8 has demanded payments as much as tens of thousands of dollars each from hundreds of researchers who have used the MMAS8 scale in their research. And this led not only to fines and people paying this sort of money, it also led to several retractions, often when researchers could not afford to pay $10,000 or $15,000 for an 8-item psychological scale. And of course, this disproportionately hits scholars from disadvantaged communities and so on, and it's very obvious, right? And again, I want to highlight this is completely fine legally what the authors are doing here. I just take ethical issue with it. Another thing, and if somebody wants to write a paper with me on this, reach out to me. I think this will be a nice short paper, but I currently I'm out of time. I looked up some of the translation work of the MMAS8. And the original authors of the MMAS8 are, of course, on these translation papers, for example, into a Korean version. And these are psychometric papers reporting on the scale, quality, and so forth, and the psychometrics. But the authors don't report conflicts of interests. And I think that's really problematic because the authors make money from the scale to have psychometric properties that will look well. They have a huge interest in making the scale look good because if the scale looks good, they make more money. And so I think that they should report COIs or the papers should be taken off. And now I want to take a couple minutes to talk about the consequences of proprietary scales. And again, in our field, I work at depression research. The Beck Depression Inventory, I believe, is proprietary, 1961, and the scale has 30,000 citations as well. It's one of the most commonly used scales in our field. So one of the issues of these scales is that it can be unclear if a scale is protected or not. Right, so I'm using, I don't know, 60 or 70 different scales in my study now. There is no list or website. It's not like proprietaryscales.com and you can look up what scale is protected. Some scales say on the author website they're protected. Some scales say on the university library website they're protected. Some scales say it's in the paper itself. And so you can never be fully sure unless you find somewhere that the scale is not protected, which authors rarely say. Here's an example. This is a 5-item work and social adjustment scale, very commonly used, couple thousand citations, and this is the end of the paper. And I only randomly, I was looking for something entirely different. If you look at the very bottom left, super randomly, at the end of the appendix, it says this: contact Dr. Marks in North End Road, London for permission to use the scale without charge. And on the one hand, that's a really great thing because this person said, you know, you can use my scale without charge. All you need to do is contact me. Great. What isn't so great is that this is the address. I tried to get permission and I couldn't because there's a Minaret Center today. I reached out to the university. They didn't know the professor and so forth and so forth. And in the end, I did get permission, but it took about 2 weeks of writing emails. And the author honestly granted permission within like 2 minutes after getting the email. But that's not sustainable, right? And if the author dies, the person, I hope the person will live very long and healthily, but the person is over 90, it's unclear what happens then to the copyright. You may have to pay to find out if a scale is proprietary or not, because like this paper I just showed you, papers are behind paywalls, and it might say in the paywall paper if you can use a scale or not, which is ridiculous in itself. Another scale I wanted to use is a 3-item scale with questions such as, I don't know, anxiety, like are you anxious right now, or have you been anxious in the last 2 weeks or so? The mini spin, 3 items, you know, very short, and the authors wanted me to pay $800 to use the scale in my study. To give you an idea, if I pay $800 for every 3 items in my study, my 90-minute online questionnaire costs me 200,000 euros, to show you how ridiculous it is to charge $800 for 3 items. And again, this is not some sort of patented biochemistry, physics stuff that has had R&D go into it. This is like a questionnaire with 3 items. And when I was asked to pay $800, the author sent me an email where it had a thing I needed to sign. including the scale should not appear in any form where it is accessible to the public, meaning I cannot tell other people the content of the scales of the measures I'm using. So suffice it to say, of course, we didn't use the scale because I think of it as a principal violation of openness. Right? It's directly opposed to any efforts to reproduce or replicate my work if I can tell you what items I used to ask my participants. And of course, it further increases inequalities. I really think, and that was a learning process for me too, we don't talk about equality enough in the open scholarship community. And this is one of the very obvious cases where not only, of course, if you have to pay for scales, it disadvantages scholars from disadvantaged communities, the global south and so forth, but also in putting together my 90-minute baseline survey, I had to reach out to my librarians 7 or 8 times about sort of international copyright law questions, such as this scale is protected and needs payment. There's a short version of the scale by different authors who tell me in an email their scale is free of use, but is it? Okay, I mean, you need sort of like lawyers in international copyright for that. And of course, guess which universities have these lawyers? Well, Harvard and Stanford and so forth. So it's a barrier. Okay, last, I'm gonna wrap it up here. I was asked by the organizers to speak to the question, if you had to choose one open science practice that is necessary to ensure transparency, what would it be? And given that I'm talking about measurement and I've worked on this, I would honestly, sorry for pitching our own work here, but we wrote a paper on avoiding lack of transparency in measurement. And this is what the paper is about, lack of transparency. We always say the first step has to be transparency. And in the paper, we have 6 questions that you can ask yourself, that reviewers can ask authors, that media can use to vet papers more thoroughly. And I think answering these 6 questions, or at least trying to grapple with these things, will help make your measurement more robust, more transparent, more replicable, more reproducible. Here are Jessica and I trying to figure out how to measure things, by the way, at the CIPS conference in Rotterdam. Yeah, last slide. Transparency is defined as the quality that makes it possible to see through something. And we talk a lot about open access, open data, the transparency of the editorial decisions and reviews. And I think we should talk a little bit more about measurement. So I thank all of you for giving me the opportunity to rant a little bit about proprietary measurement here. And yeah, looking forward to your thoughts and questions and comments.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your rant. It was great. Okay, so I don't see questions yet. Oh, maybe there is one. Yes, Anna, if you want, you can ask your question.
Okay. Hi, and thanks for the talk. It was infuriating, like to listen to what is happening. The talk was great, though. I'm just wondering, like, the suggestions you've offered are really great for researchers to do something. But if you were to offer more specific suggestions to journals and editors, like, I'm wondering, why are these papers even published? Like, if your scale is a great scale, but is behind copyright issues, that sounds like a great white paper thing or an industry report, but why are these things published? And can we do something about it?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? So there was a thread on Twitter yesterday, I think by Nick Brown, highlighting the PNAS paper that looked into, I only read the abstract, so they looked into 100 or a couple of hundred, I don't know, maybe somebody here knows, papers published in Science. And Science makes it necessary for authors to share their data upon request. And like they basically published like this table of responses of people being asked to provide data. They're like, who the fuck are you? I don't know, or you should. Like super crazy responses by these fancy famous PIs. And of course, Science will not enforce this in any way because, why would I mean, we all know why they should, but I don't know. These mechanisms are not in place, and I honestly don't know. I think I don't know if journals can do that because they have these things in there already, right? Like in my field, perspectives or psych science, they all have things in place. People get badges for open data on open stuff, and you ask, and then there's no data. and then nothing happens. Like, it's not like they remove badges from papers. So I think we just need to take this stuff a little bit more seriously. And I think that happens once journals stop using this as an incentive to sell their papers more. So it didn't take long after the badges were implemented when I received my first email from a journal saying 80% of our papers have now open data badge. But they don't. They have the badge because it's used as a indicator of quality now. But if you look at these, it's just not true. Or pre-registration. In psych science, you get a pre-registration badge if one of your many studies is pre-registered. And so sometimes people have a paper with 7 studies and an N is 10 studies pre-registered, and the other 6 on which all the inferences are based are not pre-registered, but you get your badge. So you raise a fantastic point. I don't know how to solve that. I think journalists need to take this more seriously, but they have no incentive at the moment to do so, because for most of them, it's not about the science, right? It's an industry making money, unfortunately. And sorry, it was infuriating, but I'm happy I can share my. I agree, it's infuriating, but obviously we shouldn't give up.
Thank you. I mean, if you want to hear me rant, then you should ask me what kind of enforcement we should start applying when it comes to all these kind of rules. But anyway, that's another kind of rant. Liz, do you have a question?
Well, no, it was just more like a follow-up. What about the reviewers? I mean, I used to be a researcher. I got reviews, and then as a reviewer, I said, I won't review it if it doesn't have open data, or I won't review it if the measurements are not clear, right? So, but it's up to us or you guys as researchers to be informed, and then everyone have a community to say, we're going to stand up to the journal if the journal is not doing anything. But I know it's difficult, but I think it's a fitting mechanism, right? The journals needs the referees or the reviewers, and if the reviewers can impose something, maybe at some point the journal starts enforcing a bit more these rules, I hope.
Yeah, my take on this is always, if enough people participate in a boycott, it's worth helping the boycott. If not enough people participate, and I'm quite doubtful that enough will for this particular issue, I would rather be involved as a referee and have the impact I have that might be smaller, but it is at least some impact. So I tend to review, I still review for Elsevier and Wiley occasionally if I think it's my topic of interest, and I know the editor, and I think I can make my voice heard, and I do demand people to share their code at least and their measures. And usually authors are like, oh, what the fuck, I guess we'll do it. And that's at least something. And then I ask these people, even in crappy journals where this is not common, I say, I need an open data statement in the paper, please. You can share data, fine, just tell us why, minimal standards. And I've been making quite good experience with at least getting these. And if I reject my review, somebody else will step in and the paper will be worse and have less open science papers. I don't know, I'm unhappy with that, but I don't know a better solution at this moment. And I agree is that a boycott, of course, is a way forward, and many people support that.
Yeah, I think this is also one of the reasons behind the peer reviewers openness initiative that started in 2016, especially among some psychologists, and then it gained more and more traction. And yeah, I'm one of the signatories, so I never review papers that do not have a clear either, shared data, materials, or a justification. So I think, as you said, having minimal standards could be a very good idea. I just wonder though, maybe that's the reason why a boycott doesn't reach a critical mass, right? So we are trying to be part of the solution by staying within the system, but we're also part of the problem by not trying to dismantle the system. So I know it's a difficult, choice, but I think it's worth discussing.
100%. I do both, right? I've been invited to do stuff for some journals, and I've always rejected categorically. Frontiers, for example, I just invited all the time to edit special issues and stuff like this, and I always say, I don't support you as a journal. I think you're a predatory publisher. No, thank you. But yeah, it's a gray, difficult to navigate, I feel. I'll support everybody here taking stronger measures than I do. I think it's really
Okay. Okay, so I'm mindful of time. So, and you already answered the question that we ask everybody. So thank you for that. But yeah, I think it's time to close. I would like to thank, of course, you, Eiko. Thank you very much for joining us and for this nice conversation. Thanks to all the attendees for joining us, for all the events of the Research Transparency Campaign. There'll be a link in the chat with the program. Thank you all for your participation. Enjoy your day and see you soon.
Thanks, guys. Bye.